Hello, everyone. I called this session Rabbinic Reorganization Following the Destruction, and I think for good reason. The destruction of the temple, I would stress of both temples, the first temple and the second temple, the destruction of these temples required total reorganization in terms of the functions of the temple, what went on, who ruled the organization within the temple, and so on. What is interesting is that because we have the destruction of two temples, we also have two different reactions to the destruction. The first reaction to the first temple, and the second reaction, of course, to the second temple. What is interesting is the first reaction, the original reaction to the destruction of the first temple, is taken not by the people of Israel, but by God himself. We're told that following the first destruction, God himself, we'll look at the text in a second, God himself wandered 10 stops or 10 stations, somehow in some sort of mourning, as it were, of the destruction of that first temple. This motif, by the way, that God participated in the mourning of the destruction of the first temple, God is participating together with the people of Israel, is a well-known motif. God does not abandon the people, but rather participates with them, actually joins them, is a partner with the people. So if they are in mourning over their destruction, God, even before then, will be in mourning over the destruction of the first temple. And the first source actually alludes to this mourning or to the exile that was required as a result of the destruction. Exiled areas, God himself was required to move 10 stations for the first destruction. And equally, when the second temple was destroyed, the Sanhedrin, the body of what we will call Sanhedrin, the sages, also had to wander 10 stages. And so we have two lists of wandering. And what I find interesting is comparing the two lists. I didn't include the first list, God's wandering, but I want to point to a number of places that are mentioned in that original list. God himself is required to depart from the area of the temple, and he continues into the city. He goes to, at first he goes to areas on the Temple Mount, the altar, the covering of the ark, and so on. But then God proceeds to the town. In other words, now God is being exiled into Jerusalem, out of the Temple Mount, and into the city of Jerusalem, and he proceeds into the town, into wilderness. Even before then, he winds up on the roof of the temple, and so on. In other words, God has been dislodged, as it were, from his temple environment. And similarly, we're going to expect that to happen with the people of Israel also being removed, dislodged from their temple, but that's not quite what happened. Let's read the text. Rabbi Yochanan said, the Holy Spirit, the Shekhinah, wandered 10 stations or 10 stops, and equally the Sanhedrin. In the second temple destruction, the Sanhedrin now was required to also move 10 stations. But where did they go to? They wandered from the chamber of hewn stone, Lishkat HaGazit, which is one of the inner treasuries, as it were, of the Temple Mount, to a place called Chanut, which remains to this day a riddle. Some commentators have understood Chanut as being similar to the modern Hebrew word Chanut, that is to say, an area of merchandise, of business, and the understanding was that the rabbis ceased to use their court as a place where they would actually carry out capital punishment. There were too many murderers, there were too many brigands in the country at that time, and so they simply changed the name of the place to Chanuyot, the stores, right? But that's not our issue. Our issue is the rest of the list. They went from Chanut to Jerusalem. In other words, already the Sanhedrin is moving now from the temple area, right, to Jerusalem, to the city of Jerusalem, the wider city of Jerusalem. But they continued, the Sanhedrin continued. They're in constant exile now after the destruction. And they move from Jerusalem, the city at large, to another town, a town called Yavneh, off the southern coast of Israel. And from Yavneh to Usha. Now we're already moving up to the Galilee. And from Usha to Shefar'am, and from Shefar'am to Beit She'arim. I'm sure many people have visited the antiquities of Beit She'arim. And from Beit She'arim also, I'm sure many of you have visited the antiquities of Sepphoris. Also, these are major towns in Galilee. In other words, the list is telling us that whereas God leaves the city and basically is in exile, if we look at this list here, it doesn't really refer to exile per se. Yes, the Israelites or the people of Israel have left Jerusalem, but it would be hard to refer to this as an exile because they remain in major centers. And these are major centers where ultimately rabbis will be operating and actually become the center of the development of what we will call oral tradition. And so the rabbis now, or the Sanhedrin, has moved from Jerusalem to Yavneh, from Yavneh to Usha, Shefar'am, Beit She'arim. Again, we're all up north. From Beit She'arim to Sepphoris, and from Sepphoris to Tiberias. In other words, of the 10 stations, the last station to which the Sanhedrin moved is Tiberias. And how different this is from God's list of exile. God was removed from the center of power, as it were, right, from the Temple Mount. He's off in the wilderness, according to one list, and waiting for the people to repent. If we look at the list of the Sanhedrin, it winds up in Tiberias. Tiberias will become, in the end, the center for the Jewish Patriarchate. In other words, the two lists are not really all that parallel. The first list, God is forced to abandon the temple. He has no particular address in terms of name of a rabbi. He goes from one location to another, and that's my point. The center in the first stage is locations. He goes to the ark, he goes to the hill, he goes to whatever location requires his presence, but there's nothing really happening in those places. When you get to the second list, the list we just read, the Sanhedrin has an address. It goes to the centers of power. And this is basically, I think, my central theme throughout this session. And that is the new leadership becomes a leadership of people rather than centers of power, rather than geographical centers of power. In other words, the centers don't move from one area, from one location to another location. They move rather from the leadership of one sage to the leadership of another sage to a school and so on. And we see this in source number 2. Our rabbis taught, justice, justice shalt thou follow. This means follow the scholars to their academies. How different this is from the exile in source number 1. There, God and then the people are exiled. They're uprooted. It's not clear where they're going to go. Here we're told, follow the scholars to their academies. Eliezer to Lydda, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to Bror Chai. Here they don't connect Yochanan ben Zakkai to Yavneh, but rather to a smaller town, also in the south, called Bror Chai. Rabbi Joshua to Peki'in, Rabban Gamliel from the renowned family of patriarchs, or ultimately to be identified with the family of patriarchs. Rabban Gamliel to Yavneh, he will be identified as a central figure in Yavneh. Rabbi Akiva to Bnei Brak, Rabbi Mattia to Rome, Hanania ben Tradion to Sichnin, Josi ben Chalafta to Sepphoris. And then something even more interesting takes place. The Sanhedrin has been exiled not just from Jerusalem, but in fact is slowly to be exiled from the land of Israel. It's heading to centers of Torah, to rabbinic centers, not to particularly archaeological sites or renowned sites of the past, but rather to new centers of tradition. And so whom else do we follow? We follow Rabbi Judah ben Batera to Nizibis, which takes us towards Mesopotamia. Rabbi Joshua to the exile. The word exile almost invariably refers to Babylonia. We get back to the land of Israel now. Rabbi to Beit She'arim. Rabbi is, of course, Judah, the patriarch, to Beit She'arim. Or the sages, follow the sages to the chamber of hewn stones. In other words, we've had the destruction has caused uprooting. It's required an exile, the movement of people. But the movement is different than God's movement. God goes from one area to another, but not necessarily connected to people, to specific people. Whereas the Sanhedrin moves from one, we can call it now rabbinic center, one spiritual center to another spiritual center. And that's the major difference between the two exiles. And now we see how the rabbis try to affect their movement, understand the movement from one place to another. What does it mean that we've left Jerusalem and have moved to a place called Yavneh? Look at source number 3. If the festive day of Rosh Hashanah fell on a Sabbath, we, of course, do not blow the shofar on Shabbat, but then, in the Second Temple period, they used to blow the shofar in the temple, but not in the rest of the city or the rest of the country. In other words, originally the shofar on Shabbat was blown only in the temple. After the destruction, and so again now we're looking at results of the destruction. So one of the results we've already seen was exile, and now we encounter a different type of result. After the destruction of the temple, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai ordained that it, meaning the shofar, should be blown on Shabbat. In other words, you, as opposed to our common halacha not blowing shofar on Shabbat, Yochanan ben Zakkai says it should be blown on Shabbat. Where? In every place where there was a court, a Beit Din. In other words, this is critical. The idea is a center is formed by people. A Beit Din is a court. So if until now the centers were well-known cities, now they are concentrations of sages where certain functions take place. So we're told that you can blow the shofar on Shabbat where there is a court, a Beit Din. One of the rabbis sees this. He could have been present at the time that Yochanan ben Zakkai said, let's blow the shofar. Rabbi Eliezer said, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai laid down this rule only for Yavneh. In other words, the original testimonies claimed the shofar was once blown Shabbat in Jerusalem. Now it is moved to another center, meaning Yavneh. That's the interpretation of apparently some of the rabbis, but not of all of them, because the other rabbis at that event, they said to him, meaning to Eliezer, it applies equally to Yavneh and to any place where there is a court. In other words, this is critical. The rabbis here maintain that a center represents the concentration of people, of sages, of scholars. A center is not a well-known city going back in history. And this is a critical point. If we skip over number 4, we can look very briefly at number 4. Originally, the lulav was taken in the sanctuary for 7 days, and in the country only 1 day. In other words, originally, we of course pick up a lulav throughout the holiday of Sukkot, but originally we were told that 7 days only in the sanctuary, and in the rest of the country 1 day. This until the temple was destroyed. So here again we have a type of reorganization, right? When the temple was destroyed, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai ordained that the lulav be shaken in the country for 7 days. In other words, what was once done only in the temple now will be done throughout the country in remembrance of the sanctuary. Zecher lemikdash. But again, if you were alive and you saw that Yochanan ben Zakkai said, yes, we used to blow the shofar only in the temple 7 days, now we're going to do this wherever there is some sort of a court, he may call it Zecher lemikdash. Yochanan ben Zakkai may say this is in remembrance of the temple, but of course one might ask, is it not intended to be the replacement of a temple? When you take customs that once functioned only in the temple and move them elsewhere, does elsewhere become the total replacement? Will the synagogue be the new temple, or will the laws be totally different? And sure enough, we have an event, some story that seems to point to the clash of ideology. Source number 5. Our rabbis taught on one occasion, Rosh Hashanah fell on the Sabbath, and all the towns gathered. The big problem was Rosh Hashanah fell on Sabbath. Are we going to blow the shofar? The shofar used to be blown on Sabbath only in the temple, and now the question is, there's no temple, do we blow the shofar on Shabbat, on Sabbath? When the temple was destroyed, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said to the sons of Batira, right? All of them, we're told on one occasion, Rosh Hashanah fell on Sabbath, the towns gathered. In other words, they weren't sure. This hadn't happened prior to the destruction, and so we don't know, do we blow the shofar or not on this particular Shabbat? And so we're told that all the towns gathered to see what would happen. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said to the sons of Batira. The sons of Batira were former guardians of temple service. They're mentioned in other sources. And so Yochanan ben Zakkai tells these guardians of temple service, right? He tells them, we are going to blow the shofar. In other words, yes, there is no temple, but we cannot abrogate the custom of blowing the shofar on Shabbat. Then it was done in the temple. Now it's going to be done here, right? Here, apparently meaning Yavneh, although it's not quite clear. They all gathered somewhere. So the sons of Batera were told, we're going to blow the shofar. You are going to blow the shofar on Shabbat. And I'm sure this caused an uproar. What? We can transgress the laws of Shabbat by blowing the shofar, even though there's no temple? And so they apparently opposed the move. They replied, sons of Batera, let's discuss it. This is a critical issue. If we blow the shofar today without a temple, we're abrogating the centrality of the temple, and maybe for all time. So, do we blow the shofar on a Shabbat after the destruction or not? Said Yochanan ben Zakkai to the sons of Batera, we will blow the shofar. They said, let us discuss it. This requires a long, learned discussion because the movement may be interpreted as foregoing the need for a temple for posterity. Who knows? And so I almost would translate, let's discuss it as let's form a committee. In other words, this requires really a long, very learned discussion. And of course, what it really means is let's put this off. He, Yochanan ben Zakkai, said, we will blow meaning the shofar, and then discuss it. In other words, I've decided that the custom that once existed in the temple will continue here where we are seated, and we will blow the shofar now, and then we can discuss it. After blowing the shofar, they said, now let us discuss it. He, Yochanan ben Zakkai, replied, there's nothing to discuss. The ram's horn, the shofar, has already been sounded at Yavneh. There is nothing to discuss after an act has been taken. In other words, this is a fait accompli. We've blown the shofar. There's nothing else to discuss. So here's Yochanan ben Zakkai, I would almost say taking the horns in his hand. In other words, taking action and saying, we have got to take action after the temple. We have no room for long discussions. Does the temple practice still exist? Doesn't it exist? And so on. This was not the only issue to come up after the destruction. Major issues, legal issues, religious issues now pose themselves for the first time. And here, source number 6, I gave just one example. A person who converts to Judaism at this time. In other words, if a person wants to convert to Judaism, we know that there were usually 3 conditions for converting to Judaism. If it's a male, you of course have to undergo circumcision. You also immerse in a ritual bath, in a mikvah, right? And then there's a third requirement. You've got to put money aside because ultimately you will have to bring a sacrifice. A convert to the temple, a convert to Judaism in temple times would have to offer up a sacrifice in the temple. But there's no temple now. What they did was they would put money aside and basically say, when the temple is rebuilt, let it be soon, b'mehera b'yameinu, when the temple is rebuilt, this money goes for the sacrifice, meaning for the third condition of conversion. And so I'm reading back now on the text. A person who converts to Judaism at this time, when there's no temple, must still set aside 1/4 shekel for the offering of a pair of pigeons, should the temple be rebuilt. In other words, you've got to provide for the potential sacrifice if the temple is rebuilt. Shimon ben Elazar said, Rabban Yochanan, meaning Yochanan ben Zakkai, put the matter to a vote, and the practice was annulled because it could lead to wrongdoing. This is a fantastic source. Basically, somebody wants to put money aside to offer up a sacrifice, hopefully bimheira yibaneh hamikdash, because the temple will be rebuilt any day now, right? And the source says, basically, don't hold your breath. If you put money aside now for a sacrifice, and the temple is not rebuilt forthwith, these monies are somehow going to be mishandled. They're going to be misused. Somebody's going to say we need money for a particular event, for a particular outlay of funds. In other words, the source seems to be saying, we really don't know when the temple is going to be rebuilt. This source is critical in our understanding of Yochanan ben Zakkai's mentality. I can't build under the assumption that the temple will be here next week, right, or immediately. And this seems to be a tendency in some other rulings of Yochanan ben Zakkai. Look at source number 7. Originally, the witnesses to a new moon would transgress the Shabbat even on all the months. If witnesses see the new moon, we call this, of course, the sign of Rosh Chodesh. Witnesses see a new moon. They are required to come to the temple to testify before the particular sages who are there that they saw the new moon last night. Ergo, today is Rosh Chodesh, is the beginning of a new month, right? And they may transgress the Shabbat in their travels. They can also transgress in the other direction if it means informing, right, one of the communities about Rosh Chodesh. So originally, the witnesses to a new moon would transgress the Shabbat even on all months. After the temple was destroyed, Yochanan ben Zakkai said, are there sacrifices brought anymore? Well, here's Yochanan ben Zakkai, the practical, as it were, thinker who has his doubts about whether we've seen it in the earlier source, right? Has his doubts whether the temple will be rebuilt within a day or two or a week or two. There's no temple service now. And so he says, are there sacrifices brought anymore? Why do we have to transgress Shabbat every month to inform Rosh Chodesh? They therefore ordained that the Sabbath should not be transgressed for any months except Tishrei and Nisan. These 2 months, of course, are the 2 months of the holidays, Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, and Nisan, Passover. And so here again, we find Yochanan ben Zakkai taking a step backwards from a full-fledged belief the temple is imminent, is about to be built. So there's reorganization, there's rethinking, but the rethinking is, when do we make decisions that relate to the previous temple? When do we follow practices of the previous temple that no longer exists, like blowing a shofar on Shabbat? Are we carrying over temple reality to a post-temple reality? Are we claiming, yes, there's no temple, but we have to behave accordingly as if there were a temple? That is not necessarily the step taken by Yochanan ben Zakkai. He seems to be much more cautious, right? And there's also this question of priests in the synagogue. Has the synagogue become a new temple? In other words, again, this is the recurring question that keeps on cropping up. So let's look at source number 8. Priests may not ascend the raised platform. Raised platform is a duchan, is a raised platform upon which the priest would stand to bless the people standing before them. So the priestly blessing, of course, is a well-known factor in synagogue service. Now we're told that they may not go and praise, as it were, the congregation, rather bless the congregation from that platform while wearing their sandals. Why? Because in the temple period, Kohanim would also remove their sandals before blessing the population, or those that were gathered. Priests may not ascend the raised platform in their sandals. By the way, the fear that the Talmud said is because one of the leather straps may tear, and then the priest would have to bend down and fix it, and this would cause some sort of a distraction. So priests cannot praise, as it were, or go on to the platform with their sandals. This was one of 9 regulations issued by Yochanan ben Zakkai. So that just as Kohanim in the temple were forbidden from wearing sandals, now the same here. What does this suggest? And here again, we're left in some sort of a doubt, right? Are we telling the Kohanim, you behave here just as you behaved in the temple? Is this then in remembrance of the temple? Is it to suggest that there are certain temple practices that should be maintained, right? This is very, very a difficult, I would say, question that doesn't really find one answer. Ultimately, we're told that all sorts of debates broke out. This, of course, is in the post-temple period, when in fact the rabbis now, and we saw where they gather in a whole series of different cities, engage in argumentation, have all sorts of opinions, and ultimately, as we read in source number 10, at first there were no disputes in Israel. The court of 71 was in the court of the hewn stone, Lishkat HaKasit. In other words, there was a special court in Jerusalem. There were other courts throughout the land of Israel. And ultimately, they would decide what the halakha was. I'm skipping a few lines here. But when the disciples of Shammai and Hillel became numerous and did not serve their masters sufficiently, in other words, things got out of hand. There were too many opinions, too many sages, too many rabbis with different opinions. And as a result, no longer is there only one recognized halakha. Disputes multiplied in Israel, and there emerged 2 Torahs. And so what we find is a multiplicity of opinions among the rabbis. Who is going to solve this problem? And I decided to end with this last source because it leaves us with some doubt. It was taught, we're told that for a lengthy period of time, there were debates between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. These said, halakha kamotenu, the halakha is like us. The others said, no, the halakha is like us. There were debates that preceded, the making of decisions. And this, of course, takes place, before the destruction, but it would take place after the destruction as well. And so it was taught. A voice, bat kol, issued forth and declared, these and these are the words of the living God. Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. In other words, yes, there are many debates among scholars as to what the halakha should be, and a voice comes out of the heavens. Now this, of course, is meant to be God himself informing what the halakha is, but now comes something interesting. And this is really in the spirit of what I've suggested. These are the words of the living God, but the halakha is according to the house of Hillel. Ultimately, a voice coming out of heaven, right? The Bat Kol said the halakha follows Hillel. Rabbi Bibi, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, said, where did that voice issue from? And the answer is, the voice issued forth from Yavneh. The decision is in the hands of Yavneh, not of some sort of deity, unseen, unknown, but the voice, the decision comes from the concentration of sages, of rabbis. This was the major reorganization of the post-temple period, understanding that the center is to be redefined. The center is no longer just a geographical location where decisions are made. The center is a congregation of sages coming together, debating, disputing, and then deciding. And this, if I referred in our at the beginning of our talk today to rabbinic reorganization following the destruction, this, of course, is the most important reorganization to follow the destruction. This restructuring, this redefining what the center really represents. Where is the center? Is the center in an ancient town, near some archaeological remain? Or is the center where people gather, b'makom sheyesh Beit Din, as we read earlier, a place where there is a court, meaning a collection of rabbis? This seems to be one of the major steps taken in reorganizing the Jewish community after the destruction.